This is John Saxon, and you're watching a brand new DVD of Black Christmas, a film I starred in over 32 years ago in 1974. In the early 70s, horror cinema had not yet created a Michael Myers who stalked the streets of Haddonfield, nor a Freddy who even thought about invading the dreams of the children on Elm Street. But a film was about to be released to the world, a film that was very important to horror cinema and very influential. That film was Black Christmas. Black Christmas started life when a young Canadian writer named Roy Moore read a story about a series of murders in the Westmont section of Montreal. He sent the script out to many agents and studios, but no one was willing to touch it due to the nature of the script. Bob Clark made some changes and formed a modified package called Stop Me. Clark saw this movie as an opportunity to try to make a movie where you never got to see the killer. Could it even be done? Would audiences accept the twist and the lack of a resolution that other movies almost always had to deliver? Eventually, changing the title to Black Christmas, Bob Clark and its team hired a crew of young actors and actresses who would all go on to much bigger things in their respective fields. Olivia Hussey was booked to play our tortured heroine, Jess Bradford, the sweet young college girl, who has a rather highly strung boyfriend, Peter Smythe, played by Keir Dullea.
I'd never done a scary film, and Bob approached me to do it, and I just loved the whole idea of getting away from home, going there and doing something I'd never done before, and being the heroine of this very frightening plot. The whole experience was beautiful. Andrea Martin was very funny. She was a comedian. I didn't get to know Margot Kidder too well. She was very quiet and off on doing her thing, and Keir Dullea was very sweet.
First person I met for Black Christmas was Bob Clark, and he was holding auditions. He held my audition in a big hotel suite he had. As you can tell from the movie, you know, my part wasn't that big, you know, and so for him to get an idea of my acting ability, he had me read the Keir Dullea role. And when I finished, I remembered Bob kind of, you know, doing this and looking away, and I said to him, well, Mr. Clark, wait, I can do it better than that. He says, no. He says, that was fine. He says, in fact, I'm wondering why I didn't see you for that part.
I don't remember a lot about the actual audition, although I do remember meeting Bob Clark. Very, very jovial man, isn't he? He was back then, he still is now. I don't really remember a lot about it. I mean, apart from probably having to read my few lines, and I remember being very happy getting the part because, as I said, it was the first feature film that I had done at that point and was about to be my first screen kiss as well.
I came on later to play the role of local police Lieutenant Ken Fuller.
I think there was a sense of continuity and evenness in the character. He seemed to be somebody who was understanding, could see a little bit, like a detective should, you know, see into the situation, pick up little traces, and he was calm with all of those things. I think it was an attractive role.
It was the first day on the set, and I think John Saxon was off, you know, meditating and concentrating on what he does. And I was kind of lost, you know, and so I started working and doing the scene and so on and so forth, and I remained somewhat frustrated. But somehow before the end of the day, I said, you know what, this works. So I figured this works, and I think I discovered the character of Sergeant Nash, in a sense by accident, but becoming aware of my own frustrations, I suppose. And then, of course, as it went on, and the laughter and the jokes and so on and so forth, I said, this is, I like this character. And I rediscovered that, a few days ago watching it.
Black Christmas really led the way when it came to defining horror and slasher film conventions.
I think the longevity comes from that it was so unique at that time. I mean, I would think all the John Carpenter films and all the Nightmare on Elm Street, all those films came much later. And certainly some of the techniques that Bob was using, and Reg Morris and Burt Dunk, very innovative for the time, because nobody had actually shot that kind of horror movie unless you go way, way back.
I think what I've learned since, because I've seen on television from time to time other films that were obscure that had the same ingredients. It was copied. And I think, real film buffs have indicated or said enough for me to understand that films that I never have seen, like Halloween or Friday the 13th, were kind of spawned from it.
It's got a rhythm, it's got a tension. There's no question that this is a scary movie still today. There's no question that there's a sense of a pervading sense of terror and danger for these girls, and all of that is there. Usually, there's a different rhythm and a pace in films today, and this one appears to have been close enough that you don't notice that sense. Which sometimes when you watch an old movie, the rhythm's wrong, the pace is wrong, the subtleties are wrong, and that isn't the case in this particular film. It's really, really quite strong still today.
Reginald Morris was selected as the director of photography, and he managed to give an innocent building a very ominous feel. Along with cameraman Burt Dunk, they devised a camera system for the point of view, the POV shots, that would allow the operator to keep both hands free for some key sequences.
It started, I guess, because of when I did the up the trellis shot, where I had the camera mounted on my shoulder on a special rig that I had made up, and so I guess that kind of established my hands for the rest of the movie. When we're strangling Lynn in the closet, for example, those are my hands. And again, the camera was mounted on my shoulder, and the plastic bag was mounted over the lens.
Who is it?
Throughout the film, the camera seems to close in ominously, circling the house and its victims.
The claustrophobic effect and everything was really created through the placement of the camera and the composition. And again, Reg, like I said, was a master at that, and I was the guy that physically did all that. But I mean, it was really created through the choice of lenses and angles. And but the house itself worked out very well. And I mean, I know they'd gone to a lot of trouble to find a spot that physically worked.
I mean, the character of the place just speaks for itself. It's very, very powerful. The inside, the main floor with the entrance, had particularly a very, very good staircase, because you had the scene of the girl on the phone at the bottom of the stairs, and you could see up the stairs immediately behind her, coming directly at her, not across the frame, but directly at the frame, which is much more menacing than somebody going across. And so that particular geography worked very well. You could see from that area right into the living room area where we needed a scene to happen for the party. And you could see from the area at the bottom of the stairs right into the dining area. And there was a sort of a whole geography possible for people coming and going, and lots of interest, lots of angles, lots of doorways. We painted and papered a good percentage of the house. We went with a fairly neutral tone downstairs in the main area and the hallways. And then upstairs, we tried to pick up the character of each of the girls, each of the different girls and the colors they were given. The Margot Kidder had the rather bold violet colors going for her, and the other girls had colors that were a little more appropriate for who they were and what their characters were.
Carl Zitra composed the music for Black Christmas with a very eerie piano strum mixed with wailing, moaning voices, providing a very spooky and distinctive score. To this day, it's one of the many elements that fans discuss on a regular basis.
It was a relatively quiet horror film. It didn't have, of course it had screams and stabs and its share of high intensity sound, but it reminded me of when I, in certain scenes, tried to, kill the actor along with Billy killing the actor, and I'd have stabs and shrieks and screams and musical explosions and everything that we could possibly think of. And I remember Bob resisted that from the very beginning with, saying, well, it's not necessary. Let it breathe. And I thought at the time, well, he might not be right, but I can always point my finger at him if people don't like it, that he made me do it. But now I have to say that 25 years later, he was absolutely correct. And I think that's what makes the film stand up. It doesn't overpower, it doesn't overwhelm, it doesn't insult the audience with, you must see this the way I intend for you to see it. It takes the chance, and it makes the people seem real, and it doesn't overcook the story.
Hello? Hello?
Carl also mixed the very scary phone calls and voices used by the killer, mixing Nick Mancuso, Bob Clark, and various other performers.
What do you want? Why are you doing this?
At some point, we brought in an actor, Nick Mancuso, who was, I remember, not so much specifically what he said, but I will never forget the intensity with which he delivered his lines. We experimented with filtering it for telephone and thus sharpening it up, and that was, you might think that's very simple to do. You just turn on the telephone filter or have him say it through a telephone. I can tell you it certainly was at the time anything but simple. But that sharpness, I believe, added a great deal of intensity to the voice. And I also have to hesitate to add that, I was not doing this on my own in any respect. There was a great genius of a man named Ken Healy Ray, who taught us, or certainly me, probably more about sound and music than anyone else I've ever worked with. And he came up with much of this concept of how to treat the voice.
But your mother and I must know it. Just like having a wart removed. Oh my God.
The marketing campaign in Canada was very successful, with eerie adverts appearing in the local newspapers showing weird drawings and counting down the days till a Black Christmas. The Canadian release was a great success, and the movie was picked up by Warner Brothers to show in the United States. Word of mouth wasn't generated, and the release mishandled to a poor box office return. Black Christmas has recovered a lot of ground in the last 10 years due to the efforts of fans on the internet and recent DVD releases.
Agnes, it's me, Billy.
"32 years later, we have the movie out on nearly every format known to man. The picture has been improved and the sound made to near theater quality. Where does Black Christmas go from here? Who knows? But for those of us involved, we have our own special memories of that winter back in 1974.
I think that scene, when I look at it now, I go, I really was being strangled with a bag over my head. It looks really believable to me. Now in my career, I tend to play more people that survive than I did back then.
Stabbed to death by a glass unicorn. I had never figured out when we were shooting it quite what was happening. You know, the ending of these horror movies can always be a little confusing, and I had no idea till I saw the movie what had happened to me. I knew there was a scene in which I was wrapped in stuff and blood and all that, and we were laughing so hard when we were shooting it.
I think Bob and I disagreed about the pronunciation of Fellatio. He said fellatio. I said, isn't it fellatio? No, fellatio, fellatio.
I think I'm not sure even me at that time was quite sure. So, and I realized that, so I said, let it ride, let it run, But I think I actually knew what it was before that happened. But I think when it came up, I was quite sure. So I let Nash run with it, as it were, so it worked.
I didn't see the film for years after finishing it because scary films scare me. But then when I finally saw it, I was really proud of it. It was just a beautiful little film, and I think Bob Clark is a genius of a director. I wish he did more films like that, in fact. And it is a classic. In its genre, it's a classic. It's as much classic as a Romeo and Juliet or a Jesus of Nazareth in its own way. It has a huge fan base.
When I saw it recently, I thought, damn, that is one of the most clear cases of a leading man. I mean, I was presented very, and the shots of me were very, very nice. I was presented, everything was very positive about the approach, except, of course, that the guy makes the big mistake in the end of the film.
Working with Bob, it was easy. It was pleasant. You work and you get your job done, and Bob was great to work with, I think. And then the cast were all, I think, including Margot. She was a fire. She was a life. She carried. When I was on the set with her, in fact, she was really full of life, and it was good. And everybody was. It was relaxed, and it wasn't. You didn't feel a lot of tension. You didn't feel egos running around.
It's always fun when it's an ensemble, when you have a whole bunch of people and you're all on the same page, and that's what you always hope for. Andrea was very funny. This Michael Rappaport, who wherever he is, he was a very funny guy. The lady that played the house mom, her name escapes me at the moment, but she was hilarious, and it was great fun. Doug McGrath isn't so funny, but I'm kidding, Doug.
Oh, by the way, how come I was the only one there working tonight?
We were there this afternoon, Barb.
Jesus, what's the matter with this guy?
He's suffering from shock. We have to get him to the hospital. Can you get us a car, Nash?
Yeah, let's go.
All right, McCloskey. You heard what the lieutenant said.
Right.
Now, gives me an extreme amount of pleasure and privilege to bring up three of the people responsible for the incredible film you have just seen. Composer Carl Zittner, star John Saxon, and director Bob Clark. Questions that a lot of you have, some of which I'm pretty sure Bob won't answer, but I know that there's plenty of others that he will. So,
I'll answer any question. I may lie.
Okay. This gentleman here.
Yes.
Who are Billy and Agnes?
Who are Billy? They're my cousins, and they financed them. I have a whole story, sub-story, about Billy and Agnes. They are brother and sister, I'll tell you that much. In my story, they are, Billy has abused his younger sister. There's a history, spoken and unspoken. The unspoken part of it is perhaps Billy killed his parents, perhaps he sealed Agnes up for years. There is a remake being done with a very wonderful team of a young writer-director team, and they're going to go further with the question of Billy and Agnes and Peter. We obviously are pulling a puzzler at the end. Could it have been Peter? There are two reasons why it probably couldn't, especially the ending is clearly it couldn't be because he's still alive. The other one that I think I wasn't quite deft enough is when Peter comes downstairs after the one obscene phone call. He might have had time to do all those things up there, though I doubt it. I wished I had Peter come down to Olivia on the phone with John Saxon a little quicker, so you would have said, gee, I don't see how it could have been Peter. But there are other reasons, if you want to think about him, why it really couldn't have been Peter. He didn't fit some of the criteria that were needed.
you talk about Reginald Morris, your cinematographer, and the relationship you had working on the preparation for this?
Okay. This was my first film with Reg, a great cinematographer, the brother of, what's his name, Dan? Oswald Wright was his brother, great English. Oswald Wright. Reggie Morris, Oswald Morris. Reggie was a great technician. We spent elaborate time. We had, I think, nine or 10 weeks to shoot the movie, even though we only had $400,000. Here, because of the difficulty of getting a 30-year-old print, but we spent elaborate time talking about it and planning and thinking this over. And it's not an easy movie in terms of its light and dark, and it's still, but it was very, very well planned and thought, and we took the time to shoot it, so it worked.
I've read, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've read over the years that you apparently a few years after this were planning a semi-sequel set around Halloween, or that some kind of a follow-up set around Halloween. I don't know if that's true, and if it is true, what your plans were for that at all?
Well, it's part of the story's Pockrell. I'll tell it very quickly. I did a movie 4 years later. I started a movie with John Carpenter, set in the Tennessee mountains with retarded people, and John was a great fan of Black Christmas. That's why he got Warner Bros. To hire me to do this movie. And he said, are you going to do a sequel to Black Christmas? And I said, no, I don't intend to do any more. Your film is my last horror film. I'm not in the business to be a horror filmmaker. It's just a good way to start a career. I'm not ashamed. I'm quite proud of him. And John said, well, if you did do it, what would it be? And I said, well, I would have it that the killer was caught. It's later that year, the next fall, and he has escaped, and he's going back to the sorority house, and I'm going to call it Halloween. So, but let me say this, John Carpenter wrote a screenplay, directed a movie, cast it, did the music, edited, did all of that, and in fact the movie was brought to him by the company with the title already on. So I think John, he loved the movie, and I believe he was influenced some by it, but he did not copy my movie, and Halloween is entirely John Carpenter's, and it's one of the greats of its kind.
The sound of the phone calls, was that just your voices, or was there something special?
There were, it was quite a story. There were three of us. I was one of them, Nick Mancuso, young actor who's had quite a career since. That was the beginning of his career, and a young lady whose name I can't remember. And we spent a great deal of time on those voices. We really did. Marty was telling me that Nick, you guys were telling me that Nick said I had him standing on his head to try to create a different sound. So we worked elaborately. We spent probably 2.5, 3 weeks doing those phone calls. And the story elements in it are very important, what he's saying. Nothing contradicts the state of mind that we might pursue in the end of it. But yeah, they're untreated. They're no mechanical, slight reverb and that kind of thing. But they're just our voices. We didn't fake anything with them. I was curious to see that I thought, first time he spoke, Nick sounded like Keir Dullea, and it shocked me. I went, oh, wait a minute.
I read the script. I liked it very, very much. But then was told, it was offered to me, I think, and I accepted. And then I was told that someone called and apologized and said that they had made a mistake. That some other portion of the production had already hired another actor. So I was very disappointed. But a few days later, I got a telephone call and said, from I think my agents, I think it was, could I get on a plane to go to Toronto late in the afternoon, the same day? Apparently the other actor decided not to do the part. And so I took the plane up to Toronto, and the first scene I did, I think about right at the moment I got into the literally was it.
Time to get makeup.
Yeah, I got makeup, and we worked on that scene in the park where I was with the megaphone until I don't know 2 or 3 in the morning.
The story is actually a little more flattering to John. I had wanted John in the first place. When I first called his agents, there was a conflict. He couldn't do it. So who I did hire was, most of you probably won't remember, a great actor named Edmund O'Brien. Yeah, some of you do. He was a great fellow. And I was quite pleased. It was a good choice if I couldn't have John. And Edmund came up to Toronto, and I had the worst day of my life. Edmund was in the first stages, not the first stages, near advanced stages of Alzheimer's, and I spent an hour, more than an hour, about 2 hours in John's room at the hotel while talking to him, because the managers called me to say that there may be a problem, better be careful. And I waited an hour while this man put his coat on. It took him an hour. He could talk well. It was tragic. My heart was broken. He told me how he got on the plane. His 9-year-old son said, "Dad, now you're working. It's all going to be okay." Oh, my God. And we were going out to do this scene to John. That was early in the film. And I couldn't send Edmund. I thought I would take a chance because he was coherent. He wasn't, but we'd have blanks. But I realized I couldn't send him in that weather. So we made an emergency call, and sure enough, John's other thing had fallen through, and he was able to come and rescue us, and we took Edmund to the plane, and he never worked again. I think he did one other small part with somebody, but that was a tragic, deep story.
Oh.
So that's the real story.
It's amplified.
Yeah, you were the first one.
Well, how did you come up with some of the sounds that we have in this?
Some of the sounds, okay. Some of the sounds were, this was in the day, as everybody here will know, before samplers, before synthesizers. So much of these sounds came from a piano that I destroyed. I scraped it with combs and brushes and forks and recorded it as many ways as I could think of, reversed it, put it through reverb, sent it to a recording studio, had other things done to it. That any of it survived all that mangling is really quite surprising. But they were mostly concrete sounds that you find anywhere, and then we manipulated them. And much of it was voices, sometimes from the same woman whose name I can't remember either, that helped us with the phone calls. Vocals sung into the piano to excite the strings of the piano, recorded backwards. I mean, anything you can think of we did to the sound. I'm glad it worked for you. I was never sure at the time.
Well, did you also choose which recordings of the carols would be used? Because all of the traditional Christmas carols that are in this still have a really kind of creepy, eerie tone to them that's really effective.
Well, in fact, we made those, as my recollection serves me well enough. I think we recorded those Christmas carols. Now, those children that you see outside were not the vocalists, but I think every Christmas carol that you hear in the movie, we recorded specifically for the purposes.
Except the first one.
The first one, that's quite correct.
Yeah, I have another question for John Saxon. I'm just curious, it's a dark movie, but what was it like to do all of the comedic scenes within that?
There was no difficulty in doing them. Working with Bob on the film was, in my part of the thing, very collaborative. It was rather easy. Bob merely and very clearly had in mind what he wanted to do in every shot, and he explained it very simply to me, and I found I caught on very, very quickly, and I think I understood what was happening, what to do, and I think we had a very good working relationship. Yeah.
Yep. That's John is a really fine actor. I do come with all my ideas to begin with, but when you've got great actors, you have to be open to their ideas. You have to let them flow, and a surprising amount more than John probably remembers came spontaneously. He has little moments like coming down the stairs and they talk about Barbara. She's upstairs asleep, and he added, "We'll leave her, we'll let her sleep." And that gets a nice laugh from the audience because we've seen her fellatio act. How many here know what the word fellatio means, by the way? Okay, almost everybody.
We had a dispute about the pronunciation.
Oh, I don't, what, fellatio or fellatio?
No,
it is?
Fellatio, I said.
Oh, right, yeah, it is fellatio. It is oral sex, for those of you that didn't know.
Either way, how long was the actress wrapped in plastic for?
Oh, well, let's see. She probably about 60 seconds a shot. She was very good. She did not ever a flicker or a movement from Lynn. She did a remarkable job. It was the limit of her. I don't think there are any takes on her for more than a minute. maybe some of the pullbacks, but by the time we got back, she was able then to breathe a little bit.
John, this is obviously not the only horror film, successful horror film that you've done. I was just wondering, because you've done a number of genre films, different genres. Do you have a particular favorite type of genre to act in?
The drama, plain simple drama. At this stage, I really would like something, you know, sort of mature and emotional. I've done an action film, I've done a karate film, I've done some other, you know, horror films, Nightmare on Elm Street. The first of which I thought was really interesting, but progressively I think they use it as a vehicle for special effects, and it began to lose more and more, in my estimation, of its of a real meaning of whatever dreams are about, and the meaning of them, and so on. Special? No, I mean, I think what I said at the beginning is what I'd like a really, I feel like a different person from when I started my career, and looking for a role that would be, I don't know, serious.
The other question was actually about the phone calls, which are so intricate and disturbing and evocative. I'm just curious, was it written out that detail in the script, or was it more improvised afterwards?
It's not written out in that much detail. We created it as we went. It is in the script. The nature of it is there.
How involved was Roy Moore with the film once you were shooting?
I had him pummeled every morning before we started shooting, but I let him on set. No, Roy was involved. He was there. No, I don't think he was. No, I don't think. He was working on another project. That's right. I virtually never have writers on the set because I think it's just difficult. And I write myself. And some films I do a great deal of work on. Death Dream, Alan Ormsby's script, I contributed almost nothing. Murder by Decree, maybe the original idea of Murder by Decree was my concept, but John Hopkins wrote a great script. I may have contributed 10%. This one I did, Roy and I worked together. I contributed a great deal to this one, but some I contribute a lot, some I don't, and some I've written myself, Porky's and Christmas Story with Gene Shepard, of course. It was his work. When a Stranger Called really did literally rip the idea off. It was rather direct. I was so surprised. I didn't see it, but when I heard that famous line, "The killer is in the house, the calls are coming from the house," is quoted from it as well. It's always nice to know you've been inventive. What I really tried to invent in this movie more than anything else, you know how college and high school students had been. It was beach blanket bikini until virtually to this film. A few films of intelligence had been done before that. Help me out, guys. What was the one example I used?
Well, you had A Separate Piece, maybe. You had
Rebel
Summer
Without
of 42.
Right, even earlier than that, though, some of the...
Rebel Without a Cause.
Rebel Without a Cause, you had young people, but they were literary young people. And I think in this movie I tried to create real college students, and I'm really kind of amazed at how they hold up here. They're pretty much today. They aren't that much, the vulgarity has something to do with it, but their attitude, their coolness. So I wanted these people to be as real as possible. No college, high school, rah-rah, beach blanket bikini, and I'm quite pleased with. Yes?
What were some of your influences for Black Christmas? What films influenced you?
It sounds arrogant to say, but I actually had none that I know of. Clearly, I was not a huge movie buff. I came out of the legitimate theater. I liked films, but I was just a guy that liked films. I wasn't a student. I remember one film, and I cannot remember who the star was. It was a pretty good lady star. If I remembered her, we'd all remember the film a little. It wasn't a famous film, which had a little bit of this camera work, but only used it for a few minutes at one point. Up until then, I hadn't seen that. I know people had used it. I'm not the first one to use subjective camera, but to make it a whole character, it could have been. That's not the one though. It's like a two-word title, but that sense of, again, as I say, I wanted the camera to involve the audience and be a subjective camera as well as when it's the point of view of the killer.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you selected the key locations, Sorority House?
We searched a long time for that sorority house. I had my people out. I'd selected one in northern Toronto. I wasn't happy with it. I finally decided I'm going to take a walk around. I walked around Rosedale and the environs, and that was private property, so I actually walked onto that property and got the back, because you can only see the back of the house from the road quite a ways away, and I knew immediately, God, this is it. It was like born. Everything about it, the way the stairs led down to the hallway and the hallway into the living room, so I could do all that as one tie-in, and then the actual attic thing, it was there leading down to the telephone. So it was a great find. I lucked out and found it, because for 5 or 6 weeks I couldn't. Next. Yes, sir.
Who played Peter's piano audition when it was such a big day?
This guy right here.
Here's how we did that. For Peter, or Keir Delay, well, we had music for this already. It had to be. The order was make it something very strange. I think we did that part rather well. Yeah. But Keir Delay played the piano. He listened to what we were playing, and he sat and played it. You see his shoulders and his body movements. And then for close-ups, I did it. I put on Keir Delay's wristwatch and sport coat and was shot by Burt Dunk, and then it was all cut together, and that's how it happened.
If you listen carefully while Olivia's asleep, you hear someone say, shall we check the rest of the house in the attic? And you hear him say, no, don't touch a thing to the state. And we're accurate, we're right on the money. A state forensic crew would come, not a small town college. They would not touch that location. That's why they weren't stupid that they didn't go up and find them. They were not going to do that, and it's not good police work until the forensic team got there. So we're perfectly justified to have him up there, and he's pretty bright because he probably knows that too. So I just felt the same way you do. That image is so grim. I wanted to make that the last thing we see. We hear him. We know he's there. So let's have 2 more questions, and we'll get out of here. Anybody? Okay, well, folks, I appreciated this turnout. You guys were terrific.
Once again, a thunderous applause for Carl Zittner, John Saxon. There are writers and directors in this audience. I know who you are. Give this man the dramatic part he deserves. And Mr. Bob Clark.
Do you look at your experience in Black Christmas as a highlight of your career, and why or why not?
Not so much a highlight. The highlights of my career, obviously, I think were Romeo and Juliet and Jesus of Nazareth, Death on the Nile. Those were like the classic highlights. But Black Christmas I took because I had just given birth to my first child, and I'd never done a scary film, and Bob approached me to do it, and I just loved the whole idea of getting away from home, leaving the baby for a month, going there and doing something I'd never done before, and being the heroine of this very frightening plot.
What was it like working with the director, Bob Clark?
Oh, fantastic. I mean, he was meticulous. He was down to doing the voice of the killer and helping to dress the bodies, and just a lovely man. We'd go out to dinner after shooting always, and he'd talk about his plans for the next day. And I mean, he really is a wonderful director. You know, as I was telling you before, the house looks dark and ominous on screen, but actually the real house was very small, and the yard around it, and he made it look very frightening, but it wasn't at all. It was a lot of fun shooting.
The movie Halloween is noted as being the film that was responsible for ushering in the modern horror genre. It really got a lot of recognition. However, Black Christmas shared the minimalist approach in terms of directing and story, yet it came out 4 years before Halloween. I was just wondering if do you think Black Christmas in a way inspired Halloween? because of that?
I think Bob Clark told me that it was the first of its genre, that kind of a film that was so... I haven't seen Halloween. I can't watch frightening films. They scare me too much. But Bob said that it was the first of its kind, that they fashioned a lot of films afterwards. It changed the way that horror films were made. You'd have to talk to Bob about why, because, as I say, I haven't seen a lot of scary films.
What was it like working with John Saxon?
John is an angel. He was just a delight. The whole experience was beautiful. Andrea Martin was very funny. She was a comedian. I didn't get to know Margot Kidder too well. She was very quiet and off on doing her thing. And Keir Dullea was very sweet, very sweet. But John was probably the friendliest of everyone.
I want to talk about the phone calls. There's some very vulgar moments in the movie on the telephone. Were you apprehensive at all about the material?
No, because actually when I took the phone call, the voice they put in afterwards wasn't the voice that I was hearing. That was added during the looping. And so I didn't really hear the really horrible things that were being said. I heard Bob Clark reading back to me, you know, things like, I'm going to get you, and I'm going to... And I had to react and be terrified. But then when you actually see the film, some of the things are horrible, and I wasn't hearing those.
So those were not in the script?
They were not in the script, no. And Bob Clark improvised them and then added them in afterwards.
Had they been in the script, would that have been a problem for you?
No, not really. I think once you commit to a project, once you start, it's like when I did Psycho 4. Once you commit, I mean, you just do it. And it doesn't matter what is being said, you go with the moment.
So what did you think of the script when you first read it?
I thought it was fantastic. I said, oh my God, this is so frightening. And then, you know, Bob wanted to do 2 alternative endings, and we didn't know if I was going to be killed or if so. I think he left it open at the end. But in one of the versions, they were going to kill me. And then he said, better that we just leave her in the house with the phone ringing, or, you know, so...
Were there any scenes in the movie that were filmed that were not used? In other words, did you film that scene where you were killed?
No, we didn't. I think because we were on a tight budget and it was the constraints of time was pretty much mapped out. I think we kept to the script pretty much, and everything that was shot, almost everything we used.
So how do you think the storyline surrounding Jess and Peter? Remember, you're pregnant in the movie? And they're setting up this thriller angle where it could be Keir Dullea, it could be him creeping around in the house. That was kind of the thing.
Yeah.
The whole idea about Jess being pregnant and not wanting to keep the baby. Do you think? Do you have any comments about that? About how it was effective in the film in terms of the storyline or the
Well, it just added to the overall intrigue. I think it was just a subplot, wasn't it? It wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, it just made it more interesting. It certainly explained my weight. You know? I was eating going to the Chinese restaurant and eating these Chinese pancakes with Bob every night after shooting, you know, and my waist was expanding. And, you know, she had that sweater on with the 2 hands holding, and those hands were getting larger and larger as I was eating more and more. So, you know, Steve Martin... I told you, it was one of his favorite films of all time. I met him when he was doing Roxanne, and he said, you know, you were in one of my favorite films. And I said, Romeo and Juliet? He said, no, Black Christmas. I saw it 23 times. I loved it. It's like in his collection. So that was flattering. It did very, very well in Europe, you know. It's one of those little cult films.
I was going to ask you what the reviews were like when the movie came out.
Oh, it said terrifying, frightening, and Olivia was appropriately terrified in it, and really good reviews, as I remember. Why, do you know different?
No, I was just asking,
okay.
You know, it's found an audience throughout the years, and I think it's one of these movies that just keeps getting
Do you know, once a year or something, every Christmas they show it at these movie theaters, and people go to watch Black Christmas and then some other Christmas movie, and so I didn't know that. I went there, I think, last Christmas, just the first time, and I was shocked at how many people loved this film.
You know, you could be called the original Scream Queen because Jamie Lee Curtis kind of wore that crown because of her screaming in Halloween.
Yeah.
But do you consider yourself a Scream Queen?
Why not? I didn't get to scream much in it, though, did I? I just looked terrified. It was the phone call. And you know, it's really hard because you're doing 4 different phone calls in a day, and you've got to make the different expressions, and it can just be the same, the repetition, not her again going, you know, so you've got to make it, vary it a little bit to, you know.
The killer's identity is a complete mystery.
Yes.
In the film.
Even at the end, I believe you never really know who it is.
Do you think this lack of information is why the movie is effective? Why or why not?
I think, and today they show too much in films. You know, I think a lot of times, like Hitchcock, you don't really see anything, but you have the idea that you've seen. Other than the bodies once in a while, the thought of some man standing behind a door, peering at you is a lot more frightening than watching somebody like, you know, you see the bodies once it's happened, but you don't actually see it happening. And to me, that's a lot more terrifying, the thought of something, than the reality of watching somebody hacking somebody, you know?
Do you remember who the actor was who played the character that was looking through, you know,
They were different people all the time. One was a double. It wasn't any particular person. You know, one time I think Bob played it, and then somebody else was behind the door and they put the glass eye in, and so it wasn't really one person. There wasn't ever one person on the set that was the murderer.
So the person standing behind the door had a glass eye?
They put in a lens, what do you call them?
A contact.
A contact, thank you.
Why do you think people like horror movies?
I think people like horror movies because they like that, like they like going to the fairground, they like that adrenaline rush, that, oh my God, terrifying, and for a minute it stops their brains and makes the hair on their arms stand up. And I can't watch a horror film. I mean, to act in a horror film and to watch one are completely different. You're not very frightened when you're acting it, you know. But I can't sit through a Friday the 13th or a Halloween, or I can't sit through them. I'm too terrified. I saw Psycho years ago, and I didn't sleep for a month. I mean, I was terrified. And you didn't really see the murders. You just saw the idea of it. The thought of being, you know, murdered naked in your shower is horrendous.
Were you proud of the film when you did it, and are you proud of it now?
I didn't see the film for years after finishing it because scary films scare me. But then when I finally saw it, I was really proud of it. It was just a beautiful little film, and I think Bob Clark is a genius of a director. I wish he did more films like that, in fact. And it is a classic. In its genre, it's a classic. It's as much classic as a Romeo and Juliet or a Jesus of Nazareth in its own way. It has a huge fan base. I get a lot of emails and messages on Black Christmas. And I have to, a little anecdote is that Elvis Presley used to watch it every Christmas, and the Presley family to this day still watch it. Jerry Schilling was his road manager and is a friend of David's and mine. And Priscilla and Lisa Marie watch it every year. It's part of their Christmas event happening at home. So that was rather nice to hear. It's a classic. It's a classic film.
So let's talk about the killer a little bit. As I said, he's a complete mystery.
Yes.
What do you think happened to him? Why is he so crazy? As an actor, did you come up with your own story?
No, because we didn't really know. As I say, as we went along, I didn't. None of us really knew who the killer was going to be. I think maybe Bob would have a different idea, but we just showed up and we said, "Well, is anybody playing the killer?" And Bob said, "No, we're never going to see the killer." Or maybe we'll see him at the end when he kills you. Or I haven't decided yet. So that's how we started the film. The killer was maybe somebody that was there behind a door every day. There was never really anybody cast to play the killer. So it was all in the imagination of the director. So we just played it really from day to day as it came.
So what have the fans been like? You say you receive emails. What do they say to you? What are the fans like?
The fans for Black Christmas are amazing. You know, they show Black Christmas every year along with a couple of other Christmas movies, and all these people come with their popcorn and their black eye makeup, and Black Christmas has got a cult following. And they genuinely love the film. They know every bit of dialogue, you know, they know the characters. It's really a compliment. It's very nice.
How do you think the film has held up over the past 25 years, or many years?
How do I think the film's held up? I think the fact that it's a classic and that I'm still getting emails today about it means that the film is holding up. I mean, yes, now you can have a lot more special effects, a lot gorier films, but I think that is a really terrifying film. Because it is so simple and it's so basic. It's somebody that's terrified. It's a madman that's living in a sorority house. I mean, the whole idea of it is terrifying. And it's all more the idea than the actual slash and gore. You know, it's the idea of being murdered that's more terrifying. Oh, God. Do I have an idea of the man that was the killer in Black Christmas? Well, it could be some warped human being that had been horribly abused by his mother as a child and hated all women, and the way he could, like, vent this hatred would be to, I know, I'll move into this sorority house. Or it could have been somebody that had a fixation on one of the girls and took it to the ultimate and decided to kill them all, you know. And maybe he just loved the fact that Jess was so silly and kept answering that phone and being so terrified, and that he thought, I'll leave her till last. I don't know. Or he was just a deranged human being that just found great comfort of living up in that attic, because, you know, the woman's body way up in the attic was never found, the housekeeper's. It was still at the end of the film. Was it found? I think her face in that plastic bag was hadn't been found, which is hard to believe that the police would, after all those murders, the police would come into the house and not check up in the attic. But maybe that's scary too.
The scene where you realize that the killer is in the house, when they say, don't go upstairs, the killer's in the house, and you choose to go upstairs, you grab the fire poker and you go upstairs, it's now kind of become, that scene has become a cliche in other horror films. And I believe you might have been the first person to do that.
You know, when you're watching a horror film, you always want to say, don't go in there, don't go in there, don't be stupid. But if they don't, there's no movie. So you have to really, you know, you have to be the actor that goes in that door so everybody can turn around and say, don't go in that door, you fool, don't you know what's waiting for you? You know, you have to do it. It's part of the script and part of what makes the audience feel like they're involved and gets the hair rising up on their arms.
If this really happened to you and you got a phone call,
I'd get out of that. If that really happened to me, I'd be out of that house so fast you wouldn't be able to say Olivia. I mean, I'd be gone. I mean, they stay, all these murders and things, disappearances, and these girls stay there. I'd be gone, long gone.
Was it difficult to play the scene then? I know you say that you go do it, you do your job, you're as an actor. Is it difficult to do the scene when you know that you'd say, it's illogical, I'd run out the door?
Not really, because playing Jess, I mean, no. She'd be there, and a lot of times, sure, through Jess's mind, she was thinking maybe it was her boyfriend that was harassing her, or, you know, who is this? And I'm sure in her head she was thinking, leave me alone. And then she got these horrible things and thought, who could that be? No. I mean, if you start getting threatening calls, you don't just pack a bag and leave. You deal with it. I mean, women are stalked every day, aren't they? So it's a form of stalking. They stalked the sorority house. This man stalked the sorority house instead of just one person. Would this be the same movie if it was in the summer? I don't think so. I think the thought of blood on snow is just frightening. I mean, and the fact that they're all huddled in these houses, and when they go out you see the breath and the scarves. It's all very dramatic. I thought it was a perfect setting and a perfect time. Christmas time, when you're supposed to be joyous and everybody's dying. I think it happened just in the month it was supposed to happen.
Horror films are a very strange kind of thing. I mean, they're movies about killers and bloodshed and death and all of that. Yet they draw a really devoted audience, people who appreciate the thrill and all of that. Do you think horror movies on some level are detrimental to society in any way?
Well, I think there's always the weirdos out there that could try to relive it or try to, you know. I personally, for myself, I love comedies. I love things that make you feel good, that, you know. But it takes all different kinds of people to make a world. I mean, I just finished another horror film, and I just love the people. Actually, horror films are more fun to do than the comedies. The comedies, because there's usually a lot of pressure, and comedies are difficult to do. No, I think for most people they're entertainment. I mean, the oddballs will always be oddballs, and I don't think they harm anybody. People go eat their popcorn and get terrified. I think it's fun.
I think the only thing that's kind of left is if you have any funny stories on set, any anecdotes from, you say, I mean, it's a horror movie, it's a scary movie, but it's
But usually on most horror films, you do get moments where you laugh when you're helping to dress the bodies and things, and the body sits up and then falls down in the middle of the scene, and then it's got to be picked up. But with this one, I think it was such a long time ago, and we were really pressured to do it, and we were all in this tiny little house, Bob Clark was hysterical. I mean, him doing the voice behind the door, and, but I don't actually remember any specific funny moment. Bob would have a lot of them if you talk to him, I think. But it was a good shoot. It was fun.
Do you remember much about where you were in 1974 in terms of coming to Hollywood and from
Is 1974 when we made it? Yeah. Well, then I was living with Jenny Salt, in a house on Nicholas Beach, which was just north of Malibu, that became a kind of center for a lot of broke filmmakers. And I don't remember how I got the part in Black Christmas, but obviously was summoned to Toronto to do it by an agent. That's all I remember.
Had you just done Sisters before that?
I'd done Sisters a couple of years before that. I'd done quite a few horror movies. I did another one called, I think I was what they call a Scream Queen, reincarnation of Peter Proud. I'd done, a lot of them. And when you did horror movies, you just sort of thought nobody'd see them. And in fact, here I am 20 or 30 years later or whatever, and those are the ones everyone remembers. So it's kind of fun.
So had you wanted to be an actor but just couldn't find any roles in Canada, and that's why you ended up moving to Los Angeles?
Well, in those days, there was a very limited height to which you could soar. And then the ceiling hit you on the head. So if you had any ambition at all, you packed up and came to LA or went to New York, one or the other. There was CBC and some National Film Board stuff, but very limited. And in those days, also in Canada, we're talking about the 60s, it was just not considered all right to be baldly ambitious, and it was not considered all right to be overexposed. So once you'd done 4 or 5 leads, it wasn't your turn anymore. It was a very Canadian attitude. It had to be fair, and somebody else had to have their turn. So I left a couple of times. I made my first movie down here when I was 18, going on 19, almost 19, with Norman Jewison. And then what happened after that? I didn't like it here, so I went back to Toronto and was very much in love with the man there. And then made my second movie when I was 20, going on 21. I had my 21st birthday on the set of Quacks of Fortune as a Cousin in the Bronx with Gene Wilder in Ireland. And then I quit acting. I'd had enough. I didn't like having to worry about my weight all the time. So I moved back to Vancouver and I learned film editing with Bob Altman, who was cutting Brewster McCloud and filming McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And then I ran out of money and came back to LA in the early 70s and did a series called Nichols. And then I just worked pretty much nonstop, one movie after the other. But those days were very heady because everybody was being an experimental filmmaker and trying new things, and it was the dawn of a new age for movies. And so because we were all thought we were being rather pretentiously young intellectuals who were going to change the system, doing something like Black Christmas was a horror movie, even though that's what we lived on and made our money from. So it wasn't something that even though it was great fun to make, that I thought would last this long. Nothing's astonished me more. It's a huge underground classic. It's just wild. Yeah.
Was it the first film then you moved to Los Angeles? Was the first one you made in Canada that after you sort of
No, I made another one a Canadian movie called, I made a couple of others. One called A Quiet Day in Belfast, in which I played twins. One was brought up in Canada and one was Irish. It was the beginning of the Canadian film industry. It was just starting. And they'd gotten the idea that you could give tax credits. And in those days, I think you got a tax write-off for investing if something, and if it was a failure, you got to write off the failure. And It was Canada floundering around trying to find its own film industry. I think that those were the days when, I don't know if it was Telefilm or what, it might have been Telefilm. Was it Telefilm? CFTC. Set it up, and there was this shock. I remember the first or second year that the only movies making money were Quebec porno films, and there's this extraordinary debate in the Parliament about, oh dear, this isn't quite what we intended by when we offered to help the film industry out. It was like everywhere in the early 70s. There was no ceilings. Everybody was flying. No, Black Christmas was very professionally done. We had a great time, though. As young people, we were a lot looser than you guys are. You know, you're all very conservative and afraid to make mistakes. In the 70s, in the late 60s, the whole idea was to get wildly out of control and see how far you could go before you crashed. No, it was very professional. Yeah.
Well, what kind of stories you remember then from the set?
A lot of shrieking, a lot of changing the script on the spot, and who could be the most outrageous. I don't have too many specifics, except that Andrea Martin was so funny and made me laugh even then. You know, when you're kids, see, when you're kids, you don't have a sense. You don't quite get that there's a possibility that everybody will end up doing well in this little group, and that what you're doing will be saved for posterity. I think if you had a sense of that when you were young, you'd be crippled.
Your character spends most of the time it's kind of comic relief in a way. Character. It's also drunk a lot of time.
Yeah.
I think Bob mentioned maybe there was a bit of that going on set too.
Yes, there was a lot of partying and drinking, not on the set, but certainly after work. Yeah.
Did he give you any directions you recall about your character? I think he said it was one of his creations, your character. He was excited to have that kind of a character in the film.
I don't remember. I remember I was attracted to her because she was wild and out of control, and not the conventional leading lady, which was always the boring part. If you got stuck with that part, it was always really dull. What directions did he give me? I think he let me loose. I think that was primarily what he let me do.
What do you remember about the other actors on the set?
I remember Olivia Hussey being very serious and earnest, and trying to make her laugh. And I don't think I always succeeded. She was a star then. Andrea and I weren't stars. Olivia was a big star. I think had she done Romeo and Juliet yet? And everyone knew who Olivia Hussey was, and she was exquisitely beautiful. And I suppose Andrea and I probably weren't sympathetic enough to the realities of the pressures of stardom that she was going through at a very young age. So we were the two goofballs, and we played off each other a lot, and we were definitely the comic relief after the camera stopped rolling, as well as on camera. I think it was a little competition who can make people laugh the most between Andrea and I, which I expect would be picked up again today if we ever worked again.
Did you know her before the movie, Andrea?
No, I think I met Andrea on the movie. It was a small pool of talent in those days, so at a certain point, everybody knew everybody. And did I meet her on the set or before? I'm not sure, but I think I met her on the set. Yeah.
One of the scenes that you played, which is the most famous one, is when you're actually murdered in the film.
Right.
With
a glass unicorn. Stabbed to death by a glass unicorn. I had never figured out when we were shooting it quite what was happening. You know, the ending of these horror movies can always be a little confusing, and I had no idea till I saw the movie what had happened to me. I knew there was a scene in which I was wrapped and stuff and blood and all that, and we were laughing so hard when we were shooting it.
Do you remember much about, do you give you freedom in terms of improvising dialogue also?
Yes, I do remember that, and I can't remember, although the famous sort of spell fellatio scene was all written by Bob. But I do remember wait a minute. I remember Bob having to shut me up, to rein me in, to have me stop improvising. That also has not changed in my life.
You mentioned that fellatio scene. Were you surprised they'd let you get away with something like that at the time, or was it?
With which scene?
The fellatio.
No, people were much less uptight in those days than they are now. It was, the late 60s, early 70s, we were saying and doing anything, and it was, I think these days you'd have all the damn Christians down your throat. You couldn't do that scene these days. What's that organization that would have you banned from being on the air, much as they banned Saving Private Ryan for using obscene language? We couldn't get away with it.
Do you remember your thoughts when you finally saw the film?
I thought it was really fun when I finally saw it, and I thought I remember thinking, oh, Keir Dullea is really good. He's really scary. Toronto in those days was just starting to blossom as a city that had jazz and blues, and things were starting to percolate in Toronto. So there was a whole atmosphere around the movie, which was, hey, we made this up. This is homegrown Canadian stuff, and look, isn't this fun? And it worked, and we were not concerned in those days with box office. And young filmmakers now run and check their box office receipts, and maybe Bob did, but none of us ever gave a damn about that sort of thing. That was beside the point. But the film itself worked and was scary and funny. And so it was that wonderful mix of horror and humor, which you kind of can't beat, which I'd been introduced to by Brian De Palma. So I got why, if you were doing horror, you had to be funny, or else it was just deadly. Yeah.
How would you compare working on something like Black Christmas with working on something like Sisters?
I remember Brian De Palma was much more driven, or seemingly so, than Bob Clark. And so it was a more intense experience, but then I was sleeping with the director, so, it's kind of different. I was going home with him every night. Yeah.
We sort of talked about it already, but in the sense that this film you didn't think it would last at all, or
Right.
become a cult kind of movie. When did you get the sense that people were still picking up on the film?
Well, it was one of those things that crept up on you gradually. You'd made this obscure Canadian horror movie and didn't think anything of it, and moved on to the next thing, and then 5 or 10 years later, some guy will stop you on the street and go, God, I left you in Black Christmas. And you'll think, oh, that's interesting. And then if it happens enough times, you get the point. A lot of people watched it and loved it and kept their memorabilia. And I still have tons of people coming up and asking for autographs for Black Christmas stuff. It's amazing to me. This was a long time ago. This was, what, almost 30 years ago we made this? Yeah, I'm old, honey. So it's sort of fascinating the way it turns out that something that you didn't put the same weight to as you might of other things turns out to have this kind of extraordinary longevity. And look at the cast. Look at all the people in the cast who went on to do well. Kind of fun.
It also has a more gradual thing, though. I mean, Superman, soon after Superman, people.
Well, that was a whole different thing. That was called being in a global hit. That's a whole different experience. That's bizarre and weird.
But now it sort of has become a kind of cult movie in a way.
What?
Superman.
Well, it's a classic. I wouldn't call it a cult movie. It was too expensive. It wasn't an underground thing at all. That was a whole different experience. Okay. I remember being picked up every morning, and Olivia would already be in the car, and I usually was disheveled and often slightly hungover, whether it be pot or booze, it didn't matter, one or the other. And Olivia was very straight to me in those days, but she was determined that she was going to marry Paul McCartney, and that was the height of Beatles stuff. So, or they'd broken up, but and I thought she knew Paul McCartney, but she didn't. But she decided she was going to marry him. So she was in one world of waiting for Paul to call. And I thought she was very English and very lovely. She was just as exquisite in person as she was in the movies. And so there were, but we had very little in common, Olivia and I was sort of mesmerized by her. And we'd drive to the set, and then Andrea and I'd hook up and
Did you ever stay
crack
on the
jokes.
set?
Stay on the set overnight?
Yeah.
No.
You know, somebody said that some actors did, the crew did. I remember that. Do you remember at all the scene where you're in the police station, you're drinking from a big can of beer?
Yeah, the fellatio scene. Where I spell out fellatio, that scene? Yes, I remember that, and I remember us all laughing hysterically when we filmed it, thinking we were being outrageous. Was I drinking beer? Is that the question? I don't think so. I think even in those days we knew that you didn't get drunk on the set. I remember Bob was very specific about what we were, as long as we got his dialogue in, if you added something that worked and that was, that added some kind of zip or character, he was fine with it. Otherwise, he just pulled you right back, you know. I do know that my character was already written as quite wild and outrageous because that's why I took the part. That's why I thought it was fun.
Afterwards, did you come back to Canada and make many more films?
Yeah. It wasn't a nationalistic thing. It was, where's the best job? There was no, I didn't personally, even though I know a lot of Canadian filmmakers did, I didn't have any sense of being part of the Canadian film industry. I just wanted to get ahead and get rich and famous and be a movie star. I didn't even get that I wanted to be an actress at that point, although I did love acting. So on a personal level, it was a matter of what was the best part. And what happened was that I got to, for some reason, do slightly more eccentric characters in Canadian movies than I did in American ones. So I accepted a lot of work in Canada. I think that's because the commercial considerations were not as great as they were here in LA.
Did you have a sense that the industry was growing at that time?
Yes, it was pretty exciting, but the industry down here was as well. There was such a counterculture boom in the late 60s, early 70s, that separating it into nations seemed beside the point to many people. Things were exploding all over and possibilities were limitless. So that applied to Canadian filmmakers as well as down here. Now, I know that for people who stayed in Toronto and Montreal, and I guess Vancouver, although it wasn't into that orbit yet, there was a great sense of creating an industry in Canada. But I wasn't really part of that. I was someone who got hired because I'd left. I think had I stayed there, I probably wouldn't have worked. You know, there was something exotic about someone who'd gone to LA and kind of made it, because I'd been in three big American movies.
Did you work in any other horror films after Black Christmas?
I've done a ton of horror films. Amityville Horror, Reincarnation of Peter Proud. Oh God, I think there's a lot of them. Yeah, I was kind of a scream queen there without knowing it.
How would you say that Black Christmas fits into those? Is it one of your favorites?
Yeah, Black Christmas had the intelligence to have a twinkle about itself, to have a good sense of humor about itself. So it wasn't quite as earnest. And Bob was very clever and smart and a good businessman and great fun. He was absolutely lacking in pomposity of any kind.
Do you have a sense the film has in a way influenced other horror films?
You know, I'm the wrong person to talk to. I'm not a horror film buff. I don't get it. They make me laugh. I remember in fact, it was while we were shooting Black Christmas, and The Exorcist came out. And it was an Easter Sunday, and I was in Toronto. I'm pretty sure it was Black Christmas. I'm almost positive. And in fact, I think it was Bob who said, go see this one. And then I went to see it, and I saw it, for some reason, with a predominantly black audience. I don't know what part of Toronto it was, and everyone started to laugh. And once she came downstairs and peed on the carpet, everyone started laughing like crazy, and we just didn't stop till the movie was over. I think that was in Toronto, or was it New York? I can't, what a blur it all is. But so there was, I did know, and I knew from Brian, that there was this very respectable, serious underground group of people who just worshipped horror movies. I mean, remember, I lived with De Palma for 2 years, and whenever he was depressed, he went to 4 horror movies in a row. But I always thought it was very odd. I'd be reading D.H. Lawrence in my room, dreaming of marrying Lord Byron or something, you know, even though he was dead. But I did know there were all these people who loved horror movies. I was just never one of them, and I'm still not, so I never quite get it. I'm kind of thrilled that this is a cult classic, but I don't know why. Is that just totally useless? I guess that's the wrong thing to say, but I don't know else to answer.
Well phrased, I think.
Do you have any favorite scenes from the film at all?
No, because it was 30 years ago, and I haven't seen it yet. I barely remember it. I just remember having a lot of fun. Yeah. We really had a lot of fun and laughed and laughed and laughed. And that's mostly what I remember.
Do you remember the turtle scene?
Oh. Yes, what happened? What was the turtle scene? What happened with the turtle?
It was, I think you're sitting on the couch.
Something about turtles humping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then going to the zoo and watching zebras.
That's right. Yes. No, Bob wrote all that. There was a few little colors I threw in, but Bob wrote the whole turtles humping scene. That's right. Doing homework was fun for this character.
How so?
Well, because your boundaries are wider than they are when you're playing a character like that than they are when you're playing the female lead, where you're limited to having to be attractive all the time, which is really dull. So when you did your homework, I remember when I did my homework back in the hotel on this one, and I can almost see the hotel room. The idea was, how far can I push this, rather than, whoops, that's not very safe. And Bob encouraged that. Yeah.
Was it fun playing a college student? You know?
Well, I wasn't much older than a college student myself, so yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
That's good. Is there any stories that we missed?
I woke up this morning and I was thinking about you guys, and I went, shit, I don't remember a lot. I was trying to, I remember going to see B.B. King for the first time at the Commodore. Is it the Commodore? No, not the Commodore. That's Vancouver. There's the Brunswick. Yeah. And stuff like that. But not from the set.
Remember any reviews of the film? Anybody comment about your acting, the film?
No, because when you make a movie, it doesn't come out generally till a year later, and you've moved on to other things, so it wasn't relevant to me. I didn't think it would ever see the light of day. It was a movie I didn't think anybody'd see. I just didn't, I put the right amount of effort into it, but I didn't take it very seriously in terms of what the product was going to be and what it was going to end up as. So it was just a delightful surprise that it became this cult classic. And I don't think when it first came out it was a huge hit at all. Yeah. It just never went away, which is fun.
How did you originally become involved with Black Christmas?
An audition. First person I met for Black Christmas was Bob Clark, and he was holding auditions. He'll help my audition in a big hotel suite he had in downtown Toronto, actually a very well-known hotel now called the Sutton Place, which is everybody stays at in the Toronto Film Festival and all that kind of stuff. And I remember that like it was yesterday, and I remember auditioning, and the as you can tell from the movie, my part wasn't that big, and so for him to get an idea of my acting ability, he had me read the Keir Dullea role. And when I finished, I remembered Bob kind of, doing this and looking away, And I said to him, well, Mr. Clark, wait, I can do it better than that. He says, no, no, no. He says, that was fine. He says, in fact, I'm wondering why I didn't see you for that part. And so I left with that kind of taste in my mouth. So that was kind of frustrating to know that, you know, if I'd had a bigger name or been more famous, I might have played that role. And I might have done a better job. Sorry, Keir. But the funny thing was, Olivia was coming in, and she hadn't acted for a while. And so Bob asked me to rehearse scenes with her. So all those scenes that she did with Keir Dullea were rehearsed with her and I.
So had you worked with any of the cast or crew members before Black Christmas?
A couple of them, mostly in commercials and things like that. Back in those days, this was 1973, the early 70s in Canada and Toronto, there wasn't a lot of work going on. Not like today, you know, Toronto's considered Hollywood North. But back in those days, there wasn't much work going on. So to make a living, I can remember sitting in a waiting room where there weren't even enough chairs, where there were just people sitting on the floors, spread out, waiting to be called in. People like John Candy, Dan Aykroyd, Eugene Levy, Gilda Radner, you know, all sitting around. We're all sitting around making each other laugh. That's what it was like in those days.
So can you confirm that the film was definitely shot in 1973?
I'm casting my mind back. You know, my mind's faulty a little bit, but you know, some things. But because that was the early '70s, and that was hippies back in those days, and we were all experimenting with things. I think it was Christmas '73 that we shot that. The reason I think it was Christmas '73 is one of the people I met on that film was Margot Kidder, and she's a pretty wild lady. Back in those days, definitely. And I remember at the house, we rehearsed something, one of the big ensemble scenes, and we stepped out. I stepped outside for a smoke. In those days, I used to smoke. She came up to me and she says, "So where are you staying?" And I said, she said, "You at the Sutton place?" I said, "No." She said, "Well, aren't you from New York?" And I said, "No." She said, "Oh, you're from L.A.?" I said, "No." She said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Here." She said, "You live in Toronto?" I said, "Yeah." She says, "Do you work much?" I said, "No, there's not much work going on here. You can find out at the beginning of the month how much work is going to be happening here, and then scramble around trying to make some money." And she said, "Well, you ought to go to L.A. because you'd make tons of money." And actually, what she was referring to was in Canada in those days, it was most of the films being done were kind of what we call artsy craftsy kind of films, you know, very sort of realistic. And I was having trouble getting cast because, you know, I was sort of too good looking in those days for, you know, to look like they kind of wanted the greasy mechanic next door kind of guy. And I couldn't get work, you know. I did a lot of theater and stuff like that. But she said, L.A. is where you want to go because they love guys like you. And she was right. So from that time on, and she told me the way to get around some things, and so I could move to L.A., told me some things to look for and stuff like that. So from then on, it was, I kind of had it in the back of my head that I was going to go to L.A., and I didn't go to L.A. until around November of '74. So it took me a long time to get ready to go to L.A. because I wanted to have a lot of cash in my hand. So eventually I had to sell my car. I had a Porsche at the time, an old Porsche that I used to drive around. I loved, and had to sell that. And actually got a cab license. Drove cab around Toronto for a while. I actually made a deal with this cab company to keep the car 24 hours a day. So then I had my own transportation, and I only had to provide them with what they expected that car to pull in 24 hours. And I grew up in Toronto, so I knew all the shortcuts. I knew how to get from point A to point B really fast. I knew the back alleys and all that kind of stuff. So I could make a lot of money. So I made a lot of cash doing that preparatory to moving to LA, which I did in November of 74. So I think it was 73 that we shot the film.
Excellent.
And it was winter, I know that. It was bitterly cold.
Do you maintain contact with any of the cast or original cast to this day?
Lynn, Doug McGrath, who else? I think that's pretty much it. I don't know what happened to. Do you remember Michael Rappaport? Remember he kind of had afro.
Andrea Martin asked me about him.
I don't know where he went. I don't know. I have no idea where he went. I don't. There's one chap. They call him the Laughing Detective. His name is John. God, he was a buddy of mine too. John. Well, a few years after that, he fell 5 floors out of a hotel or an apartment. Smoke insulation got smoke overcame him. He opened the window, fell 5 floors, and lived. Yeah. So. Yeah.
The character was Jeff Buchanan.
Wasn't he? He was called the Laughing Detective, right? He was always laughing at John Saxon.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but he was always laughing at John Saxon in the police department. Yeah. Maybe there's a subtext there we don't know about.
Now, is it true that you filmed a scene in which your character was sat with
No.
Jess? In which you were sat with Jess at the end of the film?
I don't remember anything about that.
Right.
I remember shooting the scene with John and I, and she's lying there, and it was a big, long, involved tracking shot back up into the attic, and I have, if that discussion happened between Bob and the studio or anybody like that, it didn't happen that night, and it didn't happen there. That was, in fact, I think that was one of the last days we shot, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong about that. It was certainly my last day. I remember that.
It's not something I believe personally, because I think that Bob always had intention in mind exactly who was who.
Yeah.
Just something I wanted to kind of clear up.
Yeah, I don't think, I just don't think there was ever going to be a Billy. In other words, was that never going to be any one of the characters that you saw? I think it was always going to be a mystery. It's always kind of more fun not to know who it is and not to know where they're coming from and not to know what they're about. I think it's scarier. I live out on a farm and lonely area, and if you've ever been alone in a big dark house or something and you think there's something out there, you can't put a face to it. You just think it's just a total stranger, and that total stranger will have no compassion for you if he gets inside the house. It's that kind of thing,
So you ever think Billy's going to come and visit you?
Never for a moment. He might phone me.
He likes to phone his victims, doesn't he? Do you remember, you may not have been involved, but do you remember who actually put the eyepiece in to play Billy's eye when he's behind the door?
No, I don't. I probably wasn't there when I shot it. I have worked with Bob Clark when he was directing a male sexual organ in Porky's. So I guess Bob had some experience directing a part of a person.
Okay. Where was the hockey scene shot, where you're taking shots from all of the players?
I can take you there. Well, you're going to be in Toronto, so there's a hockey rink up in an area around Yonge and Eglinton, and it's actually in the northwest quadrant from Yonge and Eglinton. If you're at Yonge and Eglinton and you go west a couple of blocks, you'll come and you'll see some parkland, some swimming pool, public pool, and things like that. You move into that park, you'll find a rink, and that's where we shot it. And originally, speaking of the hockey rink, in the original script, I don't know if you've ever seen an original script. I don't have it anymore, but the original script, my character was a forward on the team, skating up and down, having a practice. And Olivia comes and tries to get my attention. Where's your girlfriend? Where's your girlfriend? Well, Bob is one of those people who, he's pretty open about ideas. And having done a hockey movie a couple of years before this, and being Canadian, I knew about, there's one segment of practice that's kind of fun, and that's called where they pepper the goaltender with pucks. So, I told him that if I was just a forward skating up and down, she'd probably have no trouble getting my attention eventually. But if I was the goaltender being peppered with pucks and that section can go on for sometimes 5 minutes. They'll just keep firing pucks at the goaltender. She would have a lot of trouble. And also I said the sound of the pucks both hitting the goaltender and missing and hitting the boards and hitting the net and different things and hitting the posts, they actually are metal and they ring, So I said you can have opportunity for all kinds of sound effects. And he liked that idea, so that's what ended up happening, even eventually to my consternation, because we hired a bunch of guys from the University of Toronto, their hockey team, and Bob did mention to them that this actor is not actually a goaltender, so keep the pucks down, right? No, they're bouncing off my mask and all kinds of things, all kinds of places, so. But I think it's very effective in the film.
Absolutely. Speaking of locations, do you remember which park was used for the search for the murdered girl?
Well, High Park. Have you been out to High Park yet?
I've been there once, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of there's a big restaurant in the middle of High Park, and if you go straight south from that, and eventually the hill starts falling off into, it'll start falling away into what's called Grenadier Pond. There's a place called Grenadier Pond, and the reason it's called Grenadier Pond, by the way, is back in the 1700s, a group of British grenadiers were running away from some Americans that were invading Toronto, York in those days, and they tried to rush across the ice, and they fell through and drowned. There was a whole small squad of them, so it's called Grenadier Pond, and that's where we shot that.
Do you, just in terms of story, do you think that Billy was responsible for the death of the girl in the park, or is that just an unrelated incident?
No, I don't think so. I think that was just a red herring. I think that's just a little blip on the radar screen. I think he if you expanded it and if you wanted to explore it, he may have been. I think he may have been a student at the school or something like that. And I think he had a problem with sororities. That's what I think. So I think he was. I think he was just after the girls in the house.
So what was it like working with such a horror and comedy legend as Bob Clark?
Well, I've been lucky enough to work on a couple of things with Bob. I've done 3 of his films, and I was particularly fortunate in Black Christmas to have, first of all, rehearsed with Olivia for I think it was almost 2 weeks. She was in town for 2 weeks ahead of principal filming. So while we were actually rehearsing in the house, in the main living room, and during that time, Bob was interviewing and or talking to technicians, different technicians that were coming, the sound guys or the lighting guy or the DOP, the director of photography, or different people like that, Reg, stuff like that. So I got to I got to be privy to finding out what a genius he is about filmmaking. I mean, he could probably do any one of the disciplines. He could probably be a top sound man. He could probably be a top director of photography. He could probably operate the camera. I mean, he just knows everything. And there were things with some of the technicians and things like that where he wanted something, and they'd say something like, well, I don't know if we can do that. And he'd say, well, why don't you rheostat the diastat and overlap the boop bop, and then you get the sing thing, and it'll come back, and then you can reverb, and we can feed it back onto the set, and then the guys, yeah, we could do that. Yeah, we can do that. It was like who's zooming who here? It was quite astounding to watch, and I was still new into filmmaking and all that. I only started acting late '68, so this was all still new to me. I hadn't done much, so this was amazing to watch this guy. And then, of course, knowing that, then when I did Porky's next, it was just more of the same, only I knew what to expect.
Was that a fun shoot on Porky's as well, was it?
A lot of fun, yeah. A lot of fun. We had a lot of fun. It's always fun when it's an ensemble, when you have a whole bunch of people, and you're all on the same page, and that's what you always hope for. Most of my great experiences working have been when it's been an ensemble and when everybody, when there's not a lot of ego involved and everybody's aiming for one thing. I guess my best experience ever was a series I did called ENG, and we shot for 5 years, and I mean every day the cast and crew look forward to coming to work, and it would be hard at the end of the day to get them to go home. And that was somewhat like what Porky's was. We worked long hours. I think a week before shooting, we lost over $1 million in funding. Somebody dropped out. So it was, we were tap dancing as fast as we could on that thing, but we had a ball. It was great fun. And Black Christmas too. Andrea was very funny. This Michael Rappaport, who wherever he is, he was a very funny guy. The lady that played the house mom, her name escapes me at the moment, but she was hilarious. And it was great fun. Doug McGrath isn't so funny, but I'm kidding, Doug.
So did you ever keep any props from the movie? Because we reckon that your big fur coat would raise a few dollars on eBay.
I have a fur coat at home. I have a raccoon coat at home, yeah. I wouldn't let it go for less than $50,000 though, That was my own coat, by the way.
You still got that?
Yeah. I've still got the fur coat hanging in the closet. It's one of the few things I've saved from that era.
And you don't want to give that to the biggest Black Christmas fan in the world?
No, I don't. Who would that be, by the way?
I'll let him know when I see him.
Unless that affects how things are edited and stuff like that. But then I've got an in with the editor, I think.
It may buy you more screen time, we'll see. So, who do you personally think Billy was?
Like I said, well, I know it wasn't my character. I know that. And it wasn't Keir. I don't think it was Keir's character. The only person I can think of is maybe it was John Saxon. No, it's that kind of thing that even if I knew, I don't think I'd tell. But I don't know, honestly. I really don't know. Bob never told me who Billy was.
When was the last time you watched Black Christmas?
Probably a couple of years ago. I'd rather watch Black Christmas again than this other film I just watched a while back that I did with Chuck Norris called The Octagon. And I don't know what I was thinking in The Octagon, but I had a helmet head of hair like it. It was just, it had a life of its own. And I just watched it a few weeks ago, and it was just excruciating. You know, so some of these things we don't like to watch, but I don't mind watching Black Christmas. You know, it was. I guess that was my first really good part, other than these other films I had done. And working with Bob Clark was quite an experience. He does like to work with actors. He does have a habit sometimes, and I don't think I've ever told him this. I think maybe I did. I don't know. I might have mentioned this to him on the golf course, but he likes to. Some directors like to just subtly tell an actor how he wants a scene to do, or if the actor does the scene, give him some suggestions, or try to be subtle about it and let the actor discover and explore. Sometimes Bob likes to show the actor how to do it, right? Here, do it this way, you know. And it's always funny to watch him because, you know, he tends to be big and broad, you know. So you have to, I always sidle up to the actor and say, just not quite as the way Bob does it, you know. So, but I don't watch it much. I don't, you know, I mean, there's so many films, and I love movies, but there's so many films I'd rather watch. The last movie I watched was East of Eden, and that is a fabulous movie. Fabulous performances. Yeah. So.
Okay, just to finish off, if a brilliant young writer comes up with a cracking script for a sequel to the original Black Christmas, would you consider reprising your role with Chris Cage?
Yeah, I think it'd be fun to bring, you know, come back as the character and you know, try to find, you know, what's happened. Every actor looks for, what you always look for in a script for a character is, you know, how does the character change over the course of the story? And so it'd be fun to reprise Chris now, to see what he's developed into. And I think it'd be fun for people to see. I think I'd like to see a sequel where, you know, Billy surfaces again, if we will, you know, but surfaces in a subtle way so that we have to find, and maybe we discover who he is. You know, maybe it might be interesting. So if you know any writers like that, Dan.
We'll see.